Welcome back once again to the Diplomatic Lounge. Moscow and Russia are again in the news, and unfortunately once more for all the wrong reasons. But we don't want to speak about the terrible terrorist attack, not even the ongoing war in Ukraine, but rather how this will play out in Russian diplomacy, what the narrative will be and what kind of spin will be put on the events. And to start this, we go back a number of years. In the 1980s, together with some other colleagues at the UN, we got acquainted with Sergei Lavrov, who was then a young Soviet diplomat of the Gorbachev school, and very different from the Soviet diplomats we had known up to that point, who confirmed a certain stereotypes about the Soviet Union. They were rather stiff and uncommunicative. Sergei, as we could call him then by his first name, was a pleasant and easygoing fellow, and we all liked him. And when I see the same Mr. Lavrov so many years later as one of the henchmen of President Putin, I can't help but thinking of all the bad diplomacy that the 20th century has seen. And Mr. Lavrov, because I don't want to call him Sergei anymore, in my eyes has fallen to the level of Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, Molotov, the sinister henchman of Stalin. And we have to ask ourselves once again, why do things go from better to worse? Another colleague of mine back in Brussels, with whom I talked about this not long ago, and who had known Sergei even better than I, said she wanted to send him a letter simply asking, Sergei, when did you lose your soul? And it's a legitimate question. Bad diplomacy has been a hallmark of the 20th century. Diplomacy failed to prevent two world wars. The ending of the First World War in the treaties in Versailles basically sowed the seeds for the next one. The Cold War was to some extent a triumph of diplomacy, at least in the sense that the global conflagration was avoided. And so the end of the Cold War saw, unfortunately, a return of much bad diplomacy. We diplomats failed to prevent the war in the Balkans in 1990, which was kind of a personal, very frustrating experience for me because I was working with the UN and saw the failure from up close. Also, the European Union was unable to solve the conflicts or to prevent them. In the end, it took the United States to lend us a hand and bring some form of resolution to the wars in ex-Yugoslavia. Now, today again, we see that diplomacy has failed to prevent a war in Ukraine or the present conflict between Israel and Hamas, etc. Now, if we ask ourselves what distinguishes good from bad diplomacy and good from bad diplomats, I think there are a number of things we have to bear in mind. First of all, you have to understand, to be a successful diplomat, what the roots of a conflict are. Secondly, you have to understand very clearly who the parties to a conflict really are. And third, you have to find some kind of workable format of negotiations. We will elaborate a bit on all 3 points because I think they're relevant in most conflicts. First of all, the roots of a conflict to be addressed by diplomacy. It became clear to me, especially from the conflicts in Yugoslavia, when a conflict has very deep religious and ideological roots that go way back in the past, you cannot think that you will have a solution in the short term, even in the middle term. What you can do is to stabilize. And that is what the Dayton agreements negotiated by US diplomat Richard Holbrooke did in Yugoslavia, a precarious equilibrium that still somewhat holds, but certainly not a solution. And this is true in other cases as well. So if conflicts have more recent origins, it's probably possible to find quicker solutions that may last for a while. But when the roots go back very deep, which is also the case with Israel and Hamas, which is basically a religious war, it's very difficult to do anything but to stabilize for a while. Second point, the parties to a conflict. We see ever more conflicts where it is not states that are the war-going parties. It complicates matters considerably. I have some experience with the peace agreement that was negotiated between Colombia and the FARC, the armed narco-guerrilla in Colombia, to understand that the main challenge is to know whom you're talking to. Who can you sit at the other side of the table that's credible, representative, whose word and whose signature mean something. In the case of Colombia, it worked up to a certain point. Nevertheless, some of the guerrilleros took back up arms again after the agreements were signed. So again, this was a conflict with deep roots, not as deep as religion and historical factors in ex-Yugoslavia, but still a civil war that went back more than half a century with deep social and territorial implications. And again, what we did certainly was to stabilize quite successfully, but it's still an open question if this will be a solution for the long term or not. And the third question for good diplomats and good diplomacy is, what kind of format can you find to negotiate? Again, when you're dealing with a conflict between states, you can suppose that you have reliable colleagues on both sides of the table. Different when other parties are involved, then mostly you have to go through third parties, as is presently the case between Israel and Hamas, and it complicates matters considerably. All in all, diplomacy has not been much of a success story in the 20th century and in the 21st so far. And still, it's an essential trait of human beings. I would go as far as to say it's one of the oldest professions of the human race. When a bar fight breaks out, you'll have two guys or maybe two girls confronting each other, but there will be a third party who will be the peacemaker. It's a human stereotype. We need diplomacy, we need diplomats. And yet, professionally, we are very challenged today, and we need to come up with some real success stories. The Cold War, again, was some kind of success story, but in the present-day confusion, our diplomacy needs to become much more flexible and much more adapted to conflicts that involve all kinds of different parties, not just wars between states. Let's reflect on this a bit more and see what Russian diplomacy, led by Mr. Sergei Lavrov, whom I knew well, will make of the recent events in Moscow and how they will use this for better or for worse. Thank you and see you next time.